Very good, as I am very honored to be invited for this presentation, which Jerry chose. I gave different options, and he chose Felix Varela, thinking that Varela would not be that well known by the audience. And I did my doctoral dissertation at the Gregorian University on his contribution to the United States, and I will explain that as we move forward in the presentation. Uh, just so that you can figure it out a little bit about my history, um, I have been a priest for more than 52 years. I was a seminary rector at Boynton Beach Seminary in Florida. I was also a spiritual director of the seminary for several years. I was also pastor in Miami for 14 years in St. Agatha's Parish. And I was chosen by John Paul II to be auxiliary bishop of Miami in 2003. And I was there for 8 years as auxiliary bishop of Miami. And then Pope Benedict called me to be Bishop of St. Augustine, where I was for 11 years. So this is a little bit my background. As I mentioned, I got a doctorate from the Gregorian University in Rome. And for a doctorate, you need to write a thesis. You need to write, you have to almost like a contribute to a subject. And I chose Felix Varela because there was a popularity of him in Miami. And he was born in Havana, Cuba in 1788. As you can connect, the French Revolution was 1789. So he lived from the end of the 1780s to 1853. He became an orphan at the age of 3, and his grandfather raised him up in St. Augustine, Florida. He came when he was 3, and he was there in St. Augustine until he was 14. And in his 14 years, he chose to become a priest and went back to Havana, where we had a seminary, St. Charles Borromeo Seminary. There, he became a leader. He was extremely brilliant and became a leader in the intellectual life of the city. And he brought the sciences to the curriculum of the seminary, and he was a prolific writer. As a matter of fact, he published 7 works in Havana in themes related to philosophy and social science. He was a philosopher, and his Lecciones de Filosofía, a manual of 3 tomes of philosophy, was re-edited 5 times. So that tells you that it was a manual in the times in Latin America. He was elected to represent the island of Cuba in the parliamentarian of the Spanish Cortes in 1822. And so he left Cuba in 1821, and he never returned to Cuba. There in Spain, he had an active role in the legislature with an elaborate plan to the abolition of slavery and a project of what could be a commonweal of all the different countries in Latin America with Spain. Regretfully, the Cortes, or the legislature body in Spain, ended in a conflict with the king, and Varela had to flee, and there was a ship that was going from southern Spain, and he got into that ship, and that ship was on the way to New York. he didn't choose coming to New York. It just so happened that he was striving simply to save his life, and providentially, because providence is God leading our lives, he was led to arrive to New York on 1823. There he published in Spanish the Jefferson Manual of Parliamentary Practice, which he had an experience as a parliamentarian, and he just reflected on that experience and translated this book of Jefferson. He also published another book on the chemistry, and he was the editor in 1825. He moved to Philadelphia and was there like for a year and a half. And there in Philadelphia, he published a newspaper of 7 issues called El Habanero, which Paul Foix considered it to be the first Spanish Catholic magazine published in the United States. And so he became, all throughout his year, as he was a scholar, a philosopher in Havana, in New York and Philadelphia, he became more like a journalist. And there in the Habanero, he promoted a peaceful political change, what he called a war of reason, hoping to prevent bloodshed and war between the Spanish people and the island of Cuba. Regretfully, we are in the 1820s. It was not until 1898 that Cuba became independent. And so in a way, he was prophetic in showing a way, a reasonable way where there would not be bloodshed between the countries. In New York, he moved from Philadelphia to New York in 1826, and he became the Vicar General of New York with Bishop John Dubois. At that time, New York was not what New York is today. The bishop had to be in Europe finding funds to create parishes and respond to the needs of a huge area. And so he was both pastor of Christ Church and Transfiguration, while being Vicar General assisting Bishop Dubois and Bishop Hughes, who followed Bishop Dubois. He was very caring to immigrants, and especially creating social programs in education. He represented New York in the 1st and 3rd provincial councils of Baltimore. Today, we recognize USCCB, the United States Catholic Conference, but the United States Catholic Conference in the 1820s and 1830s, what it was the provincial councils of Baltimore. J.P. Dolan, a historian from Notre Dame, and I quote him, says about Varela, as strange as it may seem, the apostle of the church in New York City, especially of the Catholic Irish, was a Cuban priest. Varela was the founder and publisher of the Protestant Abridgers and Annotator, a magazine in New York, which Wilgin and Hatfield said that it was the first church or pastoral magazine in the United States, the first. He was also founded the Catholic Expositor and Literary Magazine in the 40s, described by Wilgin and Hatfield, who did a study on Catholic journalism, and described as the first literary and learned magazine in the United States Catholicism. He also initiated a weekly newspaper called the Catholic Observer, and then he became the editor of the New York Catholic Register until it engaged with New York Freeman's Journal at which point he was no longer editor, but a close collaborator after. So you can see a very active contribution in Catholic journalism, so much so that Wilgin and Hatzfield stated, "It seems unbelievable what he wrote besides the Habanero, and not completely 30 years in New York." Furthermore, he was very involved in defending the Catholic faith in public debates and public lectures at a time when the most intensive anti-Catholic bias existed in our country. He also published in the late 40s a work, a literary work called The Letters to Elpidio. I personally translated The Letters to Elpidio in English with the Polish Press. And that was his last and most important publication in Spanish. What is The Letters to Elpidio? They were a series of essays on social evil, organizing in a trilogy. The trilogy was impiety, superstition, and fanaticism in relation to society. And he addressed it to the youth, and that's why he chose the name Elpidio, because Elpidio, Elpis, means hope in Greek. He was inspired by Thomas of Aquinas' Summa Theologica, when Aquinas see the vices against religion by excess, superstition, and by deficiency, impiety. And Varela added the vice of fanaticism to impiety and superstition. And regretfully, only 2 volumes were published, and we don't know whether he wrote on fanaticism. If you look at the world today, the war in Ukraine, the war in Israel and Hamas, you see in other countries of Africa like Congo or Sudan, fanaticism is very much part of the causes of these wars. But regretfully, you don't find a lot of essays on fanaticism. We saw it with Hitler, we saw it with Stalin, who caused such suffering, millions of people dying because simply fanaticism, which Varela was very concerned to write about it and to reflect on it. In 1850, at the middle of the 1800s, he moved to St. Augustine, Florida, where his elementary education had taken place, where the memory of his grandparents who educated him in St. Augustine. And he died on February 25th, 1853. So Varela's contribution is the 1800s, the first 50 years of that century. The bishops of Cuba have introduced his cause, and he is a venerable. His cause for beatification is moving forward. And he's considered a very important person in the Cuban identity. So in looking at Father Felix Varela, you have almost like one half of his life is very effective in leadership in Cuba, especially as a professor. And his second part is in New York as Vicar General and pastor of 2 parishes with an incredible initiatives of pastoral care, remarkable. And the reason that I may have been interested in Felix Varela was because of his connections with St. Augustine. And if you want to read more about him, there is a biography by Joseph and Helen McCadden entitled Father Varela, Torchbearer from Cuba. And that book of these 2 scholars, educators, is a magnificent biography in English of Felix Varela, which has been translated into Spanish as well. So I am open to any feedback from you, any question, or any question not only about Varela, but any other subject that you would like me to respond to you.
Hey, thank you, Your Excellency. We do have a couple questions from the audience. So, first question, you kind already you mentioned the status that he's a venerable currently right now. So, can you explain to us what that means? Like, was there one miracle yet that he's looking at beatification, or did they just say he's worthy of becoming a saint? If you could just explain that a little bit to us.
Yes, thank you. As you are aware, the church is very strict in the recognition of a saint, because there are so many that are candidates. And so the church is very careful and requires a sign of a supernatural action from God to confirm the holiness of that Christian, of that Catholic. And there is already a miracle in Havana that is being reviewed. And so, yes, there is some signs that the cause may move forward. But as you know, the church, I envision the church as a ship. And the ship moves very slowly, moves forward, but very slowly. And on this cause, we have seen many decades where the desire to promote Felix Varela has been there, but it has been a slow process.
Okay, next question from our audience is, where's the body of Father Varela buried? Is it in St. Augustine, Florida, or somewhere else?
This is an excellent question and a complex question. He was buried in Tolometo Cemetery in St. Augustine, which you could visit today. When you are in St. Augustine, you could go to Tolometo Cemetery and you will see a beautiful chapel, a beautiful, beautiful chapel that stands out. He was buried there. But in 1911, a writer wrote that the rest of Varela were not in his tomb, that it was Bishop Verot, the first bishop of St. Augustine. And so there was a kind of an inquiry, a very thorough inquiry to see if he was really buried there or it was Bishop Verot. The inquiry mentioned that when Bishop Verot, the first bishop, in a way, probably the memory of Varela had faded, because that was in 1876, and they used the chapel that was for Varela to bury Bishop Verot. But the inquiry confirmed that his bones, that his rest, were there in that tomb, and they were taken to Havana. They are at the present moment at the University of Havana, in a particular place. And when John Paul II went to Cuba in I think 1998, he went to express a reverence toward Varela there at the University of Havana, and he gave a very important speech on the contribution of Felix Varela to society, to academia, and to the church.
Next question we have from the audience. Do many Cuban Americans in exile communities identify with him? Is he well known in Cuba?
In Cuba, he's predominantly known in the academia. There are many books written about him, and there is a great recognition of his ideas. Varela had the gift of foresight, and so he was in the 1820s, but he was envisioning what a 20th century society could be. and they recognize that he is an inspiration in the Cuban academic community. Regretfully, his profile as pastor and care of souls, which today even the Church of Transfiguration keeps that memory very alive there in Manhattan. Regretfully, that is not as well known. And that was a little bit my effort and contribution to let that face known to the people of what a great pastor, what a great priest he was in New York and in St. Augustine.
Are there any good movies or television programs that you would recommend on him?
There is a video made by a Brazilian on Felix Varela, which is excellent. Bishop Cisneros of Brooklyn and I participated in that video, and I think that could be made available. Yes, and I am not sure whether it is in English or whether it is. I think it is in Spanish, but I need to know whether it has been translated, or the footnotes in the bottom you could read the English version.
And how did Father Varela die? Was he martyred or did he die of natural causes?
He died of natural causes, and there was a Protestant lady with her children who came to his bed place, asking for blessing, Felix Varela blessing her children. And at that moment, he asked for the priest to come, and he made a Eucharistic profession on the divine presence of the Eucharist. So in this year in which a church in the United States is in the midst of a Eucharistic revival, and we are planning to have in July 17 in Indianapolis a big Eucharistic gathering, it is inspirational to think that the last words of Felix Varela was making a solemn profession on the real presence of Jesus Christ in the Eucharist. And at a time when perhaps some of our laity do not have the proper language to express that divine presence on the Eucharist, the last words of Felix Varela were to affirm the divine presence of Jesus Christ in the Eucharist.
Now, is there anything that I know you mentioned he's being beatified, but is there any mention of what someone will say? We know patron saints and their causes. Would he be considered a patron saint of any specific thing they're looking at?
That's an excellent question. He could be like Francis of Sales, patron of U.S. Journalism, Catholic journalism, because of the quotation that I had of scholars in the field who had such praise and recognition of his contribution. You know, the first 50 years of the 1800s in America were very difficult years, very, very difficult. And I think he may be considered like a father of the church, who, with being such scholarly and so brilliant, and at the same time with such a spirituality and leadership of service, selfless service, he stands out as being a remarkable model of difficult times in the church. You both, the audience and you, Jerry, know that we are going through difficult times these days, you know, with gender ideology, with reproductive rights without any duty. You know, John the 23rd taught that every right has a duty. Well, we talk about reproductive rights, but we don't talk about reproductive duties. So there are issues in our contemporary society that we need the scholarly guidance of sound sound fatherly guidance on these very difficult matters. If I have a great respect for parents, what a difficult situation they have educating their children, with the social media, with the toxic social media, and with the it's, how to raise children properly and with wisdom. Um, well, I think that Varela in his time did what we need to do in our time.
Next question from our audience. Is it true that Father Varela worked for abolition of slavery in Cuba against the Spanish government?
Yeah, he wrote a contribution to the legislature on that subject, um, and that was in 1820s. Now remember that we had to address that issue very Lincoln in the 1860s, and that's why I say that Varela had just such a foresight of in the 1820s having that vision of inclusion of women in academia, the abolition of slavery, having a common will of governance, collaborating peacefully. Yeah, the abolition of slavery shows his foresight that all persons are equal and that race, color, or culture, or nationality should not be a source of discrimination in us living as citizens, good citizens, collaborating with one another.
So, how is the church in Cuba today compared to the time of Father Varela? Is there still a lot of persecution going on? Is it a more difficult time now or from back then?
Yes, the church in Cuba and the society of Cuba is in a very difficult time at this moment. Just 250,000 Cubans came last year to USA. That tells you that there is no hope staying in Cuba, and the young families thinking of their children, they simply emigrate by all means. There is poverty. The electricity is practically gone in Cuba. The regime has been there for more than 64 years. So it's a dictatorship of an ideology. And the Cardinal of Havana, Juan Garcia, is a very good shepherd, very with the works of mercy and witnessing the care of the people. And just in last Sunday, the Archbishop of Santiago de Cuba had a prayer, a very prophetic prayer, asking for freedom for Cuba, asking for respect for the opinions, the different, that an ideology should not be imposed on the people. So Varela's dream of freedom um, is more needed than ever in the Cuban society of today.
Is there a specific novena for Father Felix?
Yes. As a matter of fact, I even have one in my left hand. Yes. And I know that there are people, to my surprise, Varela has an attraction not only for Hispanics, not only for Cubans, but to any audience. I have given lectures on Varela in Houston, in California, and my surprise is that his appeal is almost, people learn about Varela. They find that this is a person that is a light, like the McCadden wrote, a torch. And he shines in his teaching, in his way of life, in his witness, and should be remembered today because of his contributions.
What are some difficulties Father Felix may have had coming to the United States?
Well, the language. He came when he was already in his late 20s, and he knew like 5 or 6 languages, but mastering English was a challenge to him. I think he could write English better than speak English because of the issue of the accent reduction. And so I think that language was a challenge. I think also the cold weather of New York. He was more used to St. Augustine, to Havana, and being in New York and Philadelphia, like we were saying at the beginning, the conversation that I was having at the beginning, that the weather in Florida, the weather in Pennsylvania, well, he was in northeastern USA for so many decades. And I think that the reason that he had to retire to St. Augustine because he had asthma and he had other health issues, um, because he worked so hard. He was so selfless, and he would put the needs of the others over his own health.
What are some reasons you feel Father Felix may not be as well known as some other saints around the same time as him?
That's a very good question. Um, I think that as you look at the entire life, he was for 20 years in Havana and the rest of his time in the United States as an immigrant, as a pastor, as a vicar general, etc. And I think that part of that is that he's unusual in that sense, that he's part of this country and he's part of that country. He's known by this Spanish language, and yet he had a great contribution to the American Catholic Church of the 1800s. And so I think that there is a certain complexity in the mission that he had to, in his life, and the mission that he, in a way that the Lord showed him that mission. So I think that the complexity, and especially the times that he lived, we don't know a lot about the 1800s in USA. We know more about the 1900s and the 20th and 21st centuries. And so at times we are not that good in our interest for history, the history of the church in the United States. And that period of Varela was a very difficult period. As I mentioned, the bias against Catholics and the bias against the immigrants and the Italians in New York that other pictures, other movies have shown. The anti-Catholic crusade even, which was at the peak of his time in Varela's time. That's why, to me, he's a father of the church, because he was a defensor of the Catholic people in a very challenging decade. I would say more than one decades in the 1800s.
Did Father Felix have any interactions with any other saints from his time that we know about?
Yeah, there is a Haitian, Toussaint, who was contemporary of him. I also think that Mother Seton would be as well, Sister Elizabeth Seton, and at least those two names come to my mind. I am sure that there will be others that perhaps I need to know. It's a very good question, because
Yeah.
usually theologian Hans-Urs Balthasar talks about a constellation, that saints come in a constellation. in the same way that we look at the sky and we see a constellation or a connectivity and a beauty in that connectivity. And that's how it happens, that saints influence other saints and they inspire other saints. And so there is a communion. What we say in the creed, I believe in the communion of saints. Well, that's not just a statement of the creed. Like your question points so well, Jerry, that's a reality, that that communion of saints is not only our own connectivity with the saints, it's also the saints among themselves, interacting with them.
Are there any specific prayers that Father Felix prayed quite often?
Well, I think he prayed the Psalms. And in fact, he was very, he wrote on several Psalms. He also was, he commented on the Our Father, which is the prayer that Jesus taught us. And even in his journals, in his newspapers, he had comments on teaching the faith, especially with those prayers. I think that he was very, he loved Psalm 150, the last Psalm of the book of Psalms, that, as you know, has 150 Psalms. And the Psalms is the mirror of prayer of the first covenant of Israel. And so, for some reason, the church has kept those 150 poems as the prayer of the church, which we pray in what we call the liturgy of the hours, the 7 times that clergy pray the Psalms 7 times a day. And then we, what we call the breviary, the liturgy of the hours, tries to pray the 150 Psalms.
And has Father Felix traveled anywhere other than Cuba and the US that we know of?
And Spain, I don't know. I don't know of any other. No, I think that it is a trilogy: Havana, Madrid, southern Spain, and New York, and the eastern section of New York. He traveled from New York to St. Augustine because at that time, Florida was not what Florida is today, especially Miami, West Palm Beach, Fort Lauderdale, Tampa. Everything was just on the top of the state, which is what is today the Diocese of St. Augustine.
Okay, that's actually all the questions from our audience. So I'd like to thank you, especially Your Excellency, Bishop Estevez, for speaking about this to us. And if anyone else wants to watch this again, we upload our videos on YouTube. If you want to know any more events coming up, you can find them on our website, cmfwpa.org. And Your Excellency, if you'd like to conclude with us in prayer.
Yes. Uh, Dear Lord, as we are preparing for the Holy Triduum, the most important years of the days of the liturgical year, as we are looking forward to the Paschal mystery of our Lord Jesus Christ, his incredible, incredible love for us sinners, to unite us with the Father, to heal us from all infirmities, for his courage and for his self-giving crucifixion, which on Good Friday we kiss the cross, and on Holy Thursday we celebrate the washing of the feet and the Last Supper. Lord, may we be an Alleluia Christian who witness the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ, the glorious victory of our King of Glory. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Thank you again. Bye for now.